At 22:47 hours on the night of March 27, 1941, the skies above the Ruhr industrial region were layered with cloud and scattered searchlights. Below, the factories of Western Germany continued to run at reduced wartime capacity. Above them, a formation of Royal Air Force bombers crossed the border engines, set to a steady rhythm, crews braced for a long night. Inside one of those aircraft was Flight Sergeant Harold Bennett, a wireless operator assigned to a Wellington bomber squadron. His position was cramped, pressed between equipment racks and cables that vibrated constantly with the motion of the aircraft. The air inside the fuselage was stale, carrying the mixed smells of oil-heated metal and damp fabric. The steady hum of engines was punctuated by short bursts of radio chatter and the occasional rattle of loose fittings as the bomber adjusted altitude. Bennett had already flown several operations over Germany. He knew the routine well enough: long hours of darkness, the strain of maintaining silence, and the expectation that danger would come from below. Anti-aircraft fire, he had been told, was the primary threat. Night fighters existed, but they were considered unreliable, difficult to coordinate, and largely ineffective in darkness. That assumption began to feel uncertain when the intercom crackled with a brief warning from the cockpit. A dark shape had passed beneath the bomber, moving in the opposite direction, too fast and too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. Moments later, another aircraft crossed their path, this time closer, its outline briefly illuminated by searchlights, before vanishing again. The name of the aircraft responsible would soon become familiar to RAF crews flying night missions, the Messerschmitt Bf 110. At this stage, however, it appeared only as a disruption, an unexpected presence in a sky that was supposed to offer concealment. There was no explanation yet, only the sense that something had changed in the balance of the night. In the months that followed, encounters like this would alter the course of the air war over Germany. Tactics would evolve, losses would rise, and the night sky would no longer be a place of relative safety for Allied bombers. For men like Bennett, the struggle was not only about reaching the target, but about surviving the unseen space between takeoff and return. Bennett had left behind a young wife in Birmingham, along with the promise that each mission would bring him one step closer to coming home. That promise depended on understanding a growing threat that had not been taken seriously enough. Why did the enemy fear this aircraft? When the Messerschmitt Bf 110 first entered service, it carried expectations that were very different from the role it would eventually play. Designed as a long-range heavy fighter, it was intended to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and dominate opposing fighters through firepower rather than agility. On paper, it was meant to project confidence. In practice, its early combat reputation worked against it. During the daylight campaigns of 1939 and 1940, Allied pilots encountered the Bf 110 under conditions that exposed its weaknesses. Against single-engine fighters, it struggled to defend itself once engaged at close range. Its size made it easier to spot, and its turning ability was limited compared to more nimble opponents. Reports from these early encounters circulated quickly among RAF squadrons. The Bf 110 was described as dangerous only if mishandled, vulnerable, if pressed, and unlikely to dictate the outcome of a fight. This perception solidified during the Battle of Britain. RAF pilots learned that if they survived the initial pass, the Bf 110 could often be forced into a defensive position, Losses mounted, and the aircraft's reputation suffered. Within Allied intelligence summaries, it was increasingly categorized as a failed concept rather than a decisive weapon. Attention shifted elsewhere toward faster, single-engine fighters and the growing threat of massed bomber formations. By the time the air war moved into the night, that earlier judgment still shaped Allied thinking. Night bombing operations were built around the belief that darkness itself provided protection. The enemy's ability to intercept bombers in low visibility was considered limited, disorganized, and largely reactive. Crews were briefed to expect flak as their primary danger. Fighters, if encountered at all, were assumed to be rare and poorly coordinated. The Bf-110 did not fit neatly into Allied expectations of night combat. It was remembered as an aircraft that struggled in daylight and required protection rather than providing it. The idea that this same aircraft could become a persistent threat after sunset seemed unlikely. Its earlier failures created a false sense of security, reinforcing the belief that it could not adapt effectively to a radically different environment. This assumption shaped behavior in subtle but important ways. Bomber crews focused their attention downward, scanning for searchlights and flak bursts, rather than watching the surrounding darkness. Defensive gunners were trained to react to visible threats, not to anticipate attacks emerging from blind angles. The night sky was treated as an empty space, punctuated by ground fire, not as an environment where an enemy could maneuver with intent. What Allied crews did not yet understand was that the Bf-110 was no longer being asked to perform the role for which it had been judged a failure. It was being reshaped by circumstance, technology, and necessity. Its size, once a liability, allowed it to carry equipment that single-engine fighters could not. Its endurance, previously undervalued, became an asset in prolonged night patrols. These changes were not immediately visible from the perspective of a bomber crew crossing hostile territory. The reality of night fighting developed quietly. There were no dramatic announcements, no sudden spikes in reported losses that immediately explained the shift. Instead, individual crews began to notice patterns: bombers failing to return without clear cause, aircraft damaged without having seen an attacker, formations thinning unexpectedly before reaching their targets. Each incident seemed isolated, easy to attribute to chance or navigation errors. The gap between expectation and reality widened with every mission. The night was no longer neutral ground, but the evidence accumulated slowly enough that it resisted immediate explanation. By the time Allied command began to reassess the threat, the Bf-110 had already established a presence that was difficult to counter and harder to anticipate. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as inadequate was no longer trying to win daylight dogfights. It was waiting in darkness, operating under different rules, and forcing bomber crews to confront an enemy they had not been prepared to fear. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic engagement or a widely publicized defeat. It emerged gradually, shaped by necessity and refinement rather than innovation alone. By late 1941, German air defense had begun to function as a system rather than a collection of isolated responses. Within that system, the Bf-110 found a role that aligned with its strengths rather than exposing its limitations. The change began with coordination. Ground-based radar stations extended their coverage, tracking incoming bomber streams long before they reached their targets. Information was relayed through command centers that directed fighters toward specific interception zones. For the first time, German night fighters were not searching blindly. They were being guided with intent positioned to intercept bombers along predictable routes. The Bf-110 became a central tool in this approach. Its endurance allowed it to remain airborne long enough to wait for contact. Its stability made it suitable for controlled flight in darkness, where sudden movements were costly. Most importantly, it could carry the equipment required to locate targets without relying on visual contact alone. For Allied crews, this shift was invisible. They crossed the coast, expecting isolation, and instead entered an environment where their presence was already known. The first indication that something had changed often came without warning. A bomber would be struck from behind or below its crew, only realizing an attack had occurred when instruments failed or flames appeared along the wing. Defensive gunners scanning the darkness reported nothing. There was no prolonged engagement, no circling dogfight, only a brief, precise encounter followed by separation. As these incidents accumulated, German records began to show a steady increase in successful interceptions. The Bf-110 was no longer operating as an individual fighter, but as part of a controlled network. Its attacks were timed to exploit bomber blind spots and limited reaction windows. Engagements were short, deliberate, and rarely pursued beyond their initial outcome. This was not air combat, as Allied crews understood it. For the bomber formations, the effect was destabilizing. Losses could no longer be attributed solely to ground fire or navigational error. Aircraft disappeared without obvious cause. Crews reported damage inflicted by an unseen opponent, often from angles that had previously been considered relatively safe. The assumption that night provided concealment began to erode. The turning point became unmistakable during sustained bombing campaigns when patterns emerged across multiple sorties. Commanders noticed that certain routes produced higher losses, that bombers flying at similar altitudes were intercepted repeatedly, and that adjustments failed to restore earlier levels of safety. Each response seemed to provoke a counter-response, suggesting an opponent that was observing, adapting, and anticipating. At this stage, the Bf-110's presence was no longer theoretical. It was a factor that had to be acknowledged even if it could not yet be fully understood. The aircraft's earlier reputation no longer mattered. What mattered was that it was shaping the night sky in ways that forced Allied planners to rethink assumptions they had relied on since the start of the bombing campaign. The enemy had not introduced a new aircraft. They had changed how an existing one was used. That shift, quiet, methodical, and largely unseen, marked the moment when the night air war began to tilt against those who had once believed darkness was enough. What made the Messerschmitt Bf F-100 dangerous at night was not a single feature, but the way its presence altered the experience of a bomber crew in the air. It did not seek prolonged combat. It did not announce itself. It worked within narrow windows of opportunity, exploiting routines that Allied crews had come to trust. A bomber on a night mission operated under constant physical strain. Crews flew for hours in darkness, maintaining formation by reference to faint lights and instrument readings. Their awareness narrowed. The body adjusted to monotony, conserving energy for the moments when flak or searchlights demanded immediate reaction. It was within this environment that the Bf-110 operated most effectively. The aircraft approached without urgency. Guided by ground control, it did not rush to intercept. It waited until altitude spacing and position aligned. When contact was made, the engagement unfolded quickly. The Bf-110 closed from below or behind, often remaining outside the bomber's visual range until the final moments. There was little time to react, and even less to identify what was happening. From inside the bomber, the first indication of attack was often mechanical rather than visual. A sudden vibration through the fuselage, a drop in engine output, an instrument needle shifting out of tolerance. Crews responded by checking system scanning for visible damage, attempting to diagnose a failure that had no obvious cause. In many ways, the attacking aircraft was already disengaging. The structure of bomber defenses reflected assumptions formed earlier in the war. Gunners were positioned to cover expected angles of attack, trained to respond to aircraft that revealed themselves through movement or silhouette. The Bf-110 exploited the gaps between these expectations. Its attacks were brief and directional, focused on disabling rather than pursuing. Survival depended less on skill in combat and more on chance alignment at the moment of contact. Repeated exposure to this pattern reshaped how crews perceived the night sky. Darkness was no longer empty space, but an environment that concealed deliberate movement. Every unexplained sound or vibration carried weight. Crew members became alert to minor anomalies, knowing that hesitation could be decisive. The strain accumulated over successive missions, each flight reinforcing the sense that control was slipping away. The effectiveness of the Bf-110 lay in its consistency. It did not rely on overwhelming force or dramatic engagements. Instead, it imposed uncertainty. Crews could not easily learn from previous encounters because each attack revealed so little. There were no clear lessons, no visible opponent to study, no mistakes that could be confidently corrected. As losses mounted, bomber formations tightened and procedures became more rigid. These adjustments, intended to improve safety, often had the opposite effect. Predictability increased, routes stabilized, altitudes clustered. The Bf-110 benefited from this order, operating within a system that rewarded anticipation and punished deviation. In practice, the aircraft did not need to destroy large numbers of bombers to be effective. Its real impact came from forcing crews to operate under continuous threat without clear means of response. Every mission carried the knowledge that survival might depend on factors beyond training or preparation. That awareness followed crews back to base and forward into the next sortie. The Bf-110 did not dominate the night through spectacle. It did so by narrowing margins, shortening reaction times, and turning routine into vulnerability. In doing so, it transformed night bombing from a calculated risk into a persistent test of endurance. The psychological weight of facing the Messerschmitt Bf-110 at night did not manifest as sudden terror. It developed slowly, shaped by repetition and uncertainty. For Allied bomber crews, the strain came not from what they saw, but from what they could not confirm or control. Each unexplained loss altered the atmosphere within squadrons. Aircraft failed to return without having reported flak damage or fighter contact. Crews listened to debriefings where details were scarce and conclusions tentative. The absence of clear explanations became a source of tension. When a threat could not be visualized, it could not be mentally contained. The night environment amplified this effect. Crews operated in confined spaces surrounded by darkness that offered no reference points. Sounds carried differently at altitude: the constant drone of engines, the creak of airframe stress, the occasional crackle of radio interference. Over time, these background noises gained significance. Every irregular vibration prompted a check. Every fluctuation in engine tone demanded attention. The Bf-110 exploited this sensitivity without direct contact. Its presence was inferred through outcomes rather than encounters. Crews began to expect interruption rather than safety. The sense of isolation that once provided comfort now became a liability. There was no reassurance in formation when aircraft could be picked off individually without warning. This pressure altered behavior. Gunners reported higher levels of fatigue, their vigilance stretched across long hours with no visible target. Pilots flew more rigidly, hesitant to deviate from assigned altitudes or routes. Navigators double-checked calculations, aware that errors increased exposure time in hostile airspace. The effort to maintain control became constant, leaving little room for recovery during flight. The impact extended beyond individual missions. Between sorties, crews discussed incidents in fragments, partial observations, unconfirmed theories, brief flashes seen at the edge of vision. These conversations filled the gaps left by official explanations. The aircraft gained a reputation defined more by absence than appearance. It was known by what it caused rather than what it looked like. For many crews, the anticipation of the next mission carried more weight than the mission itself. Sleep was interrupted. Concentration suffered. The night sky became associated with unpredictability rather than concealment. The Bf-110 did not need to be encountered directly to influence morale. Its effectiveness lay in its ability to remain present in thought long after the aircraft had landed. Over time, this psychological burden reshaped how Allied forces understood night warfare. It was no longer enough to survive flak or reach the target. Crews had to endure prolonged exposure to an opponent that could not be reliably detected or engaged. The mental effort required to remain alert across repeated missions eroded confidence and increased the cost of each operation. The fear associated with the Bf-110 was not dramatic or immediate. It was cumulative, built from unanswered questions and repeated reminders that the night was no longer neutral. In that environment, even experienced crews began to feel that the margin between routine and catastrophe had become dangerously thin. The full significance of the Messerschmitt Bf-110's role in the night air war was not immediately understood, even after the balance began to shift again. During the conflict, attention tended to focus on newer aircraft, emerging technologies, and more visible changes in strategy. The Bf-110, associated in memory with earlier shortcomings, rarely received credit for the effect it had already achieved. Only after the war did analysts begin to reconstruct the sequence of adaptation that had taken place. Records revealed how an aircraft once judged unsuited for modern air combat had become a critical component in a broader system. Its effectiveness did not lie in independent performance, but in how it interacted with ground control, radar coverage, and disciplined interception procedures. The aircraft had not changed dramatically. The context in which it operated had. This realization influenced post-war thinking about air defense. The experience demonstrated that an aircraft's value could not be measured in isolation. Endurance, stability, and the ability to carry specialized equipment traits once considered secondary proved decisive under the right conditions. The Bf-110 became a case study in how perceived weaknesses could be reframed as operational advantages. For Allied air forces, the lessons were equally lasting. The assumption that darkness itself provided protection was permanently abandoned. Night operations were redefined as a contested environment rather than a shield. Training tactics and aircraft design began to reflect the understanding that unseen threats required systemic responses, not just improved individual performance. The psychological dimension of this shift endured long after the last sorties were flown. Veteran accounts frequently returned to the uncertainty of night missions, the strain of operating without visual confirmation, and the sense that control could be lost without warning. The Bf-110 remained part of these recollections, not because it was always seen, but because it represented the moment when the night ceased to belong to the bomber crews alone. In retrospect, the aircraft's legacy is neither one of technological dominance nor dramatic aerial duels. It is defined instead by adaptation and effect. The Bf-110 forced its opponents to confront a reality they had underestimated, that fear in warfare does not always come from overwhelming force, but from the quiet erosion of predictability. By the time the war ended, the night sky had become a place of calculation on all sides. The lessons learned there shaped the future of air combat in ways that extended far beyond the aircraft itself. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 did not win the night war alone, but it played a decisive role in teaching its enemies why the night could no longer be trusted. Why did the enemy fear this aircraft?